Alright, now that you watched the video describing what imaginary numbers are, we are going to talk about them in starting 3.2. So the video said the word imaginary is a horrible name for them, which is totally true, but that is what we use anyways. So anytime I say imaginary or is the answer real or imaginary, that's what I'm talking about. So it is defined as I equals the square root of -1. You need to note that I squared actually equals -1. So if you square that imaginary number, you get -1. And that is because if I is the square root of -1, and I were to square this, well, a square root and a squared cancel each other out. They're inverses of one another. So this would all go away, and I'm just left with -1. Okay, so that's why I squared is -1. And then let's just erase all that. That's a lot of stuff. Okay. So complex numbers are what we're going to be talking about later and get into using that unit I. But right now, we're just going to find square roots of negative numbers. Okay? So to do that, we need to consider the imaginary unit I. Okay? So if we have something that's negative being square rooted, we need to square root that, go ahead and get an answer, and we get I. Okay? So if you look at the first core concept here, right here. Alright? The square root of negative number property. If r is a positive real number, then the square root of negative r is going to be I square root of r. And that is because square root of negative r is the same thing as saying square root of -1 times the square root of r. And we know because of this rule, square root of -1 is I. Okay? And we always write the I in front of the square root. Okay? And because of that first property, if we were to square it all, we know that I squared is -1. So it would be a -1 times 3, because that squared cancels out that square root with the 3, or with the r, or whatever, and you get negative of whatever that number is. Okay, so this is the key, that square root of -1 equals I, so I squared equals -1. All right, so let's come down here and try to actually do this. Okay, so we need to remember that the square root of -81 is the same thing as saying square root of -1 times square root of 81. Alright, well, we know the square root of -1 is I. We can actually take the square root of 81 and get a nice pretty whole number, and that is 9. That just equals 9. But when we write it, 9 goes in front of the I. Okay? I always goes in front of a square root, but it goes after a whole number that's not within a root. Okay? Alright, so let's try number 2. Again, I have a square root of -1, and I have a square root of 72. Now, I can take the square root of -1 and I get I, but I cannot take the square root of -72 and get a nice pretty whole number. So we need to simplify this radical. So a perfect square that goes into 72 would be 36. That's the biggest perfect square that goes into it, and it goes into it twice. Okay, so I still have this I out here. Square root of 36 is 6, so I have a 6, and I still have the square root of 2. So to put that in order, I, like we said in number 1, comes after a whole number, and our whole number is 6, so I is going to come after it, but I comes before the radical, so the radical comes on the end. So it's always sandwiched between a whole number and a radical. Okay, I is in front of a square root, but after a whole number. Okay? Alright, now number 3 throws us off a little bit, because it all of a sudden now has a -5 out front of my square root. We just need to remember we have a -5 that's going to be in the answer. Okay? Now, this square root of -9, you can either write your I now, because that'll take care of this negative. I'll have an I. And then I have square root of 9, which we know is 3. So all of these things, I circled them because they're outside of my radical. They will be in my answer. There's no radical left like there was in number 2. So I have a -5 and a -3. I can write them out as all of this is basically being multiplied together. It's not basically being multiplied together. It is being multiplied together. So I can take -5 times 3. I get -15, and I still have the I. There's no radical to come on to the end. So that is how you do that. Go to your practice now for 3.2 and do problems number 6, 8, 9, and 12, and move on to the next video.